This time the group pressure exerted not by other individuals, but by other cultures. In a monoculture with monocultured media, there is a little second opinion. It is only the national opinion, whereby monocultured journalists educate, that is brainwash, their monocultured citizens into their own monocultured views, thus tightening a vicious circle. As the Nazis and Bolsheviks learned all too easily, it's not difficult to brainwash a whole population if one has monopoly control of the national media, as Chinese government has today ad libbing. And if state-of-the-art technology of the time does not allow ready access to other countries' broadcasts, this is why I talk about the tyranny of monocultured media. I find it abhorrent that two dictators can go to war with each other, indoctrinate their respective populations, conscript an army of gullible young men, fill their heads with visions of dying for their country, and then watch them doing just that in their millions on the Champ de Gloire, field of glory, as Napoleon said. Imagine then the impact of the nationalistic feelings of former monos when their own government is strongly criticised by the overwhelming majority of governments on the Glow Media network in the global language. Here the group pressure of 200 nations will have its effect. People's minds will be expanded to think globally. Billions of people will listen to and be influenced by, literally, global opinion. To use my Japanese case again, imagine the Japanese hearing that almost no one wants to live the lifestyle of the Japanese. It would be almost impossible to dismiss a global opinion as Japan bashing. The Japanese will be forced to confront their national ego with the bitter realization that they have no friends, and then ask themselves why. It will be a painful process, not undertaken without being pushed. In today's Japan, for example, with 98% of the population belonging to one culture, essentially of Korean DNA stock, and with a ban on direct satellite dishes to non-Japanese satellites that are not controlled by the Japanese government, then it's easy for the Japanese to remain in their state of national amnesia about their war crimes, their lifestyles, their awful conformist pressures that stunt personality growth, etc. The above is more of a future hypothetical case, but let us take an actual case that has already happened. The Europeans are leading the world in giving its citizens international television. The EU, European Union countries, often have the TV programs from their TV cables and satellite dishes of their neighbouring countries. I suspect that this fact is one of the major causes of the recent rise in European consciousness. But in the case of the French, the creation of European television in their living rooms, where one can zap cultures, British channels, French channels, German channels, Dutch channels, Italian channels, Belgian channels, etc., had a sobering effect. French culture had been dominant in Europe for centuries. The royal courts of Europe spoke French. Aristocrats sprinkled their local language with French phrases to show their sophistication. The kings of Europe copied the French kings in their palaces and their fashions. French armies were the biggest, and the French Revolution turned Europe upside down by importing Enlightenment thinking to autocratic regimes. After centuries of French dominance, it's not surprising that it went to French heads. I remember in my 20s when travelling on a train to southern France, being treated like a peasant by ordinary French provincials, that is, French people who don't live in Paris. 40 years later, things are very different. Thanks to Euro TV, the French have learned something painful, that is, they are not so special, and it has hurt them. For example, the Scandinavians are several decades ahead of them in their social legislation and attitudes. The Brits have won far more Nobel Prizes. The Germans have a bigger economy. The Americans have utterly outclassed them in nearly all respects, except in things like sophistication, intellectuality, perfumes, wines, fashion, sex, etc., which is not such a bad list, actually. The net effect of this over the past few years is that the French have been going through an inferiority complex. They feel they are nothing special, and that it's time that the French got moving again. This time they are using the vehicle of the European Union to transmit French leadership, which is not a bad strategy. Europe needs leaders, and the French and the Germans are more than willing to play that role. So it's likely that the impact of the Glow Media network will be very powerful. I'm hoping that the list of suggestions I give in the rest of this chapter on how I think each of the countries might benefit by working on their weaknesses, their cons, will be taken seriously. If thanks to the glow media, the citizens of these countries hear more or less the same criticisms and praises coming from all sides of the planet, it's difficult to deny a common message that country X is weak in characteristic Y, when over 100 countries say the same thing based on independent experience of millions of the world's citizens travelling to and living in that country. People will be forced to accept, perhaps grudgingly, the negative truths about themselves that seem obvious to the citizens of other cultures. For example, take the case of the level of religiosity of the Americans. 95% of them, according to recent surveys, claim that they believe in a supreme being, God. Europeans increasingly are becoming much less religious, to the point that they are openly sneering at American religiosity, causing a growing rift in transatlantic relations. How will Americans react when they hear Europeans ridicule American religiosity on the glow media that they do not have at the time of writing? America is still a highly insular-minded culture that is largely cut off from the rest of the world. It has been globally dominant for so long now that most Americans do not even bother to think of casting their eyes towards other countries to learn of the latter's superiorities. Many people, including myself, feel that the US has already entered its period of relative decline, and that Europe, China, India are on the rise. America, if it remains at its current size, and does not do what Europe is currently doing, that is growing into a post-nationalist union, then it will not be a player in the 21st century. America needs to start learning from other countries, otherwise its relative decline will only be faster. So there is hope that glow media in particular, together with other social forces that are discussed in detail in Chapter 5, will be the means by which countries can influence each other very powerfully, leading towards the creation of a world language, a world culture, and eventually, as a result, a global state, globa. It's therefore likely that the suggestions made below concerning the cons of the countries of Chapter 2 will not fall on deaf ears when the readers belong to the country being criticised. For the reasons discussed above, especially the impact of glow media and other factors, that the criticisms and suggestions for improvement that are to follow will be heeded in time as the world globalizes with its media, language and culture. The time has come to state my opinions as to how I think the various countries I talked about in Chapter 2 can learn from the superiorities of the other countries. The 7 countries discussed here appear in the same order as in Chapter 2, and so too with the list of cons for each country. I left out India because I don't have any first-hand experience of the country to be able to make any informed suggestions. Since the formats of the 2 chapters are the same, it may be useful for readers to keep flipping back and forth between a given con point of a given country in Chapter 2 and its corresponding suggestions for improvements in this chapter. In fact, Chapter 3 often elaborates on points made in Chapter 2. For practical reasons, in order to make suggestions for improvement, the con point being discussed from Chapter 2 is that first summarized in Chapter 3. The risk of such a strategy is that readers may feel that there are times in Chapter 3 when given con points may seem to have been repeated excessively. Hopefully I have not fallen into this trap too often. The one major difference between the 2 chapters is that Chapter 3 focuses on ideas as to how a given country might benefit from learning about the superiorities of other countries that are relevant to a con point of that country. I begin with Australia because it was where I grew up, and as I explained in Chapter 2, its influence on me may help explain why I have the opinions that I do about the 6 other countries I've lived in. I do not think that Australia is a world-ranking country, as are all the others, in my view, in this book. In a sense, only the best are insulted, the rest are also rans. C. Australia. Cons. Boring. What can Australia do to overcome how boring the place is? Well, as I alluded to fairly strongly above, I think the glow media will have a major impact on the country for the same reason that it will have on all countries. Australians will become less Australian and more globan, that is, citizens of Globa. They'll think more globally rather than nationally. They'll be exposed to the ideas of the world rather than to their traditional brawn-based preoccupations such as sport and lolling on the beach. But there will be limits to what Australia, or any small country for that matter, can do. Australia is small in population terms, only about 20 million or so, but is the size of continental USA or China in surface area, with most of it useless for habitation. due to it being too dry, too desert-like. With a small population, only a small number of talented intellectuals and artists are generated each human generation. Their numbers are usually too small to create a self-sustaining critical mass, so they do not feel supported by the values of the culture they grow up in, and hence feel alienated and disgusted. Many of them simply leave the culture, thus lowering the quality of the gene pool and tightening a vicious circle. But as Australians become more global in their minds, they'll be exposed to the best that the whole planet has to offer in terms of ideas, the arts, ideologies, attitudes, etc. They'll be equal with the best, because they'll be exposed to the best in the world. As Australians, they may not be able to contribute much due to their small population, but at least they can be absorbers of the best the planet has to offer. Glow media, and the internet of course, will make Australians and nationals of all countries more interesting, less boring, because they will have their minds expanded from the dreary limits of their small-time monocultures to the glories of a truly global culture. Very probably a global culture with a glow media to support it and sustain it will have the net effect on Australia of creating in the early years a rather deep-seated inferiority complex, similar to what happened to the French when they were exposed to European-wide media in the 1990s. As millions of Australians realise that on the world scene they don't amount to much and contribute almost nothing to world events, and especially to world intellect and knowledge. The same comment could be made about any small country. However, as the years pass, and Australians and most of the world's citizens feel more and more global and less national, their sense of identity and self-worth will shift. One can make an analogy with people living in a major city and a small town in the US. Americans have a real pride in their nationality, since they know there is a certain objective reality in their claims of being number one. Some nation at any given time has to be the top nation, as judged by surveys across the planet. So, instead of the small-town American feeling depressed about how little his town contributes to American culture, he can focus on the fact of his belonging to a greater whole, that is, the US, and feel a sense of pride, real pride. Well, similarly with Australians, or any small country. As globism grows, and people of all nations identify increasingly with their new global state, they can take a new pride in being Globans, citizens of the new Globa. Isolated. Traditionally, Australia has always been isolated, both geographically and intellectually. It's essentially a European culture situated in Southeast Asia. Most of the country is desert, with the majority of its small population living in the southeast corner of the country, where there is enough rain for some grass to grow. When I was growing up in Australia in the 1950s and 1960s, Australia had a very bad reputation internationally for being extremely provincial-minded and Philistinic, a beer-bellied, sport-oriented, anti-intellectual, anti-authority, low-class bunch of mindless middle and lower-class materialists. As will be mentioned frequently throughout this book, for emphasis, any migrant New World nation, including Australia, never had an upper class in the old world European sense. The upper class chose not to migrate. How would migrating have benefited them? They would have had to work with their hands in a virgin land without the trimmings of an upper class culture, that is, no symphony orchestras, no poetry salons, etc. In the 1970s, the young people of Australia took advantage of the new jumbo jets and mass touristed to Europe and the US, where they were rudely shocked into a recognition of their own country's general inferiority. The most talented ones simply never returned, but most did, and brought with them the realization that their own culture was a backwater in all senses of the word. They felt ashamed and motivated to lift the cultural standards of their country, and did to some extent. The recent rise of the internet, especially broadband internet, that is fast internet allowing real-time movies, videos, lectures and high-quality sound, has brought the world to Australia, and those with minds curious enough to be interested can convert themselves into world citizens. Many do, but many don't. On my recent visit to Australia, I found the young people preoccupied mainly by American pulp movies that they absorbed by the hundreds. They had had their minds colonized by the US. They used US slang, had US attitudes, and in many respects were as boring as the generation I'd left behind when I was in my early 20s, that is nearly 40 years ago, well now half a century ago at living. So, with the penetration of broadband internet, Australia may have lost its isolation. It's a fairly rich country. Its citizens travel internationally more, so the rough provinciality of the past has largely gone. But the general middle-class mindlessness seemed to me, on a recent visit, to be as strong as ever. From my perspective, the problem with migrant nations is that they do not have the intellectual upper class that has power and teeth, that expresses an impatience towards the stupidity and ignorance of the middle and lower classes and slaps them down for it. In the old world, especially those with large populations, for example over 50 million people, the top 1% in intelligence, IQ terms, amounts to a subpopulation of 500,000 people with real talent. That is large enough to generate a self-supporting critical mass. Over the centuries, this intellectual upper-class elite has disciplined the culture and made it more intellectually rigorous and civilized. But, you may object, what about the US? It has 300 million people. That's 3 million intellectuals. So why is the US not a paragon of culture and intellect? How then to explain its overwhelming middle-class mindlessness and vulgarity? I will deal with that problem when I discuss the cons of the US, but you have a point. I do not wish to spend much time on Australia, given its non-world ranking nation status. I only included a bit of comment above for the sake of completeness, and to follow the pattern of responding to all the cons of the countries listed in the previous chapter, except India, which I know very little about. We turn now to the truly great cultures of the planet, that is, the world-ranking cultures of the world, in my opinion. D. England. Cons. Poor. I lived in England in the first half of the 70s, before moving to the European continent, hoping to lead a more cosmopolitan life. So my first-hand experiences of living in the UK are somewhat dated. Having come from Australia, my first country, I was struck by how much poorer England was at that time. But lately I've been reading about the effects of Thatcherism and Reaganism, that is, the stimulating effects that free markets and the cutting back on welfare statism had on the economic growth rates of these two countries. This lesson has been well learned now, decades after these two leaders. The US grew strongly over these decades and influenced the UK due to the common language. Once the US and UK started growing well, other countries were influenced and opened up their markets to free trade. Even conservative, traditionally minded socialist countries like China, India and France have gone strongly capitalist in about that order as a result. Consulting the internet, I see that at the time of writing, this is 2007, remember, the UK ranks about 10th in the world in exchange. Oh no, this must have been about 2000. Okay, I'm not sure. I need to think. In exchange rate terms, in its GNP, gross national product per capita per person, the US was only 6th. Both countries were beaten by the Scandinavian countries and Switzerland. The UK was well above France, 17th, and Germany, 18th. So my image of the UK as being poor is no longer appropriate. This shows that a country can pull itself up by its own bootstraps and turn itself around. I didn't like the insular-minded attitude of Maggie Thatcher, the female Prime Minister of the UK in the 1980s, to the then European Community, now the European Union. So I was happy when she was fired by her party as Prime Minister, but I have to admire what she did for the country's economic growth patterns. Insular. Britain is an island and therefore inevitably, it seems, suffers from an insular-minded mentality that is so different from the multilingual cosmopolitan mentality of the continental Europeans, especially the small continental West European countries. The latter have land boundaries. The UK has sea boundaries. The Brits say overseas to refer to other countries. The continental Europeans have words in their languages meaning out of the country. For example, im Ausland, Germany. In het buitenland, Dutch, to refer to other countries, when it's so easy to hop in one's car, drive for a few hours and arrive in another country on the European continent. It's not surprising that the continental Europeans are far more cosmopolitan and multilingual than the monocultured, monolingual Brits, who have to make much more of an effort to put themselves in another country. The same argument is even stronger for the supremely insular-minded Americans. More on this later. I remember in the 1970s, living in Britain, how insular-minded I found the British. In those days, there was no international cable TV or satellite TV bringing in channels from other countries. I've read that Europe's policy of putting the TV and radio channels of the European continent into the cable and satellite of most European countries has probably had more effect than any other factor in creating a sense of collective Europeanness, and has helped considerably in easing the path of the creation of the European Union. Ad-libbing, well, events went the other way. Look at Brexit, the exit of Britain from the EU, and the likelihood of other countries will follow. So the European Union will break up, and probably Northern Europe will form a new kind of European Union, because the South is just economically inferior and cannot cope with having the same euro, the same unit of currency, supposedly having the same purchasing power. It is, after all, the Europeans who are leading the world in the creation of the next major historical political phase of building a post-national political unit, PNPU, in the form of the European Union, that so many other trade blocs around the world at the time of writing are essentially copying. Unfortunately, the Brits are slow to respond to the lead of the EU. It's mostly France and Germany who lead the EU. Britain was slow to join it and still does not have the euro, the EU's currency unit, which is increasingly replacing the dollar as the international currency unit of choice. Well, that's what I thought then. The Americans are spending more than they earn and print dollars to pay their debts. As a result, the value of the dollar is lowering, and correspondingly the value of the euro is rising. Many countries now prefer to have their reserves in euros and dollars. Both China and Japan are awash in excessive number of increasingly worthless dollars. In Brussels, the capital of Europe, where I lived for many years, the UK had the reputation of being the guard's van of Europe, or in US vernacular, the caboose of Europe, with its implication that the last carriage on the train possessed the brake that could slow down the whole European train. Thatcher's anti-Europeanism made her detested in Brussels. She was not a European. She was detested. She was perceived as being an island-dwelling Brit who did not belong to the European train. Eventually, her own political party saw the light and threw her out of power. But that was in the 1980s. Times change. Now the UK has the Channel, that is, Channel Tunnel, running under the British Channel, or La Manche, as the French call it. The Channel is as much French as it is British. It is now easy to just sit in a train for 3 hours and travel downtown to downtown, from London to Paris, and vice versa. As a result, the British have become a lot more cosmopolitan. I hear the effects on BBC radio and the internet. The classical musicians who perform in London are as likely to be French as British, given BBC travel budget constraints. The Brits, too, have broadband internet, so like the rest of the rich countries of the world, have been exposed to the best and the worst of what the world has to offer, and like the Australians above, have had their national horizons expanded. Since it has been some 30 plus years since I lived in the UK, so I did write this about 10 years ago, ad-libbing. I have to admit, my first-hand opinions on the country are dating quite a bit. A country can change a lot in 30 years, actually 40 now. It can get a lot richer, and its mentality can change as a new generation takes power with a new agenda and ideology. What happened to Britain can serve as an example to other countries that it is possible for an insular-minded, poor country to really turn itself around. Ireland is an even better example, which at the time of writing ranked 8th in GNP per capita, just above Japan and the UK. But Ireland is way too small, population-wise, 4 million people, to have much intellectual impact on the world. Actually, ad-libbing, Ireland crashed in the 2008 world crisis. I turn now to the culture whose values are closest to my own, that is, intellectual elitist. Who else could I be talking about other than les Français? France. Cons. I never actually lived in France, but I did live very close to it, in French-speaking Belgium, that is, in Brussels, for about 15 years. My then second wife, a native French-speaking Belgian, was totally intellectually colonized by French culture, reading only French magazines and rarely reading Belgian ones, or rarely watching Belgian TV. She found French media far more interesting and superior. The French-speaking Belgians number only about 3 million compared to France's 64 million. It is not surprising the French label the French-speaking Belgians as les petits Belges, the little Belgians. The latter are smaller in both size and mentality. It would be difficult for any nation to compete with the French, a nation that has given so much to the world. I must have taken the train to Paris at least 30 times over the years. With recent TGV or TGV, très grande vitesse, that is very high speed, train links between Brussels and Paris, and between Paris and most of the major cities of Western Europe, and still expanding, one can now travel between these two cities in about 80 minutes. Recently, the Americans have introduced a similar Amtrak service called Acela, A-C-E-L-A, Acela Express, but with much slower trains than the TGV between Boston and Washington, D.C., stopping at New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. So the French TGV, inspired the Americans to copy it, but decades later. But France certainly has its faults and can learn from other countries, which is something that it has great difficulty in doing, partly due to the country's linguistic insularity. The French have had a very hard time accepting that English has become la lingua franca of our times. So Anglo-Saxon ideas take longer to penetrate French minds than other minds in most other European countries. Chauvinism. As I mentioned in this chapter 2, the French used to be insufferably arrogant in an offensive way, that is, unjustified. Arrogance per se is not necessarily a bad thing, if there is, in my mind, some solid justification for it. The Americans are arrogant, almost unconsciously. They are so used to being the dominant culture for the past 50 years that they no longer even bother to consider the possibility that other countries, or political blocs, especially Europe, are beating them. Big Europe, that is the EU with its 500 million people, are constantly growing as more countries beat a path to Brussels to join the EU, is 1.5 times larger in population terms than Little America. Europeans are beating the US in so many things recently that traditional American unconscious condescension and insularity has become unacceptable to Europeans, resulting in a wave of European anti-Americanism that is pushing the US off world center stage. Until about a decade or so before the time of writing, that is, until France got cable and satellite TV, the French used to be insufferably arrogant, living in a dream world of their own imagined superiority, based on a historical reality, but no longer in tune with the modern world. But once millions of French could see with their own eyes the superiorities of their neighbouring countries in Europe and the US, and once they were rich enough to tourist internationally in large numbers, they did a complete U-turn in their self-esteem. They went from arrogant to depressed as they absorbed the lessons that they were not special. And in fact, in many respects, they were not even above average. A national malaise followed that the French still suffer under at the time of writing. The latest ploy of the French seems to be to lead the EU bandwagon and become big again. I wish them luck. Here is the case where being exposed to other cultures and their respective superiorities severely deflated the self-importance of the French and brought them into line with international realities. The same is yet to happen to the Americans, because the Americans still don't have much in the way of international media. The self-inflated ego of the Americans is just waiting to be pricked. I predict it will happen in only the next few years. Hopefully the publication of this book may make a contribution towards that end. The time is certainly ripe. More on this later. Hygiene. As mentioned in the cons section on France in the previous chapter, I was truly disgusted by the lack of personal hygiene of the French. They were truly a dirty people. I've not been exposed to French groups on a daily basis for a decade, so I don't know if things have improved much. If not, then perhaps the international media in France may create a stereotype in the French mind of les sales Français, the dirty French. And I don't mean it in a morally condescending way. I mean literally in the hygiene of their toilets and their housing, etc. If the French can feel an international social pressure against them to literally clean up their act, then perhaps they will. I can't really labour this point. La surface. One of the most maddening aspects of the French mentality that I could never accept was their preoccupation with the appearance of things in preference to the effectiveness of their function. To the French, looks are very important. Efficiency or effectiveness is secondary. These priorities to me felt superficial, childish, and very annoying, especially when French gadgets or social institutions